If you're thinking about moving to Australia, write this number down before you watch another video. The average Australian household spends roughly 130,000 Australian dollars a year. That's about 94,000 US dollars, just to maintain what most people would call an ordinary middle-class life. 2 incomes, a car, a rented home, and a couple of kids. And yes, Australian salaries are higher than you think. But so is the cost of everything that touches them. I'm not here to scare you out of moving. I'm here to show you exactly where your money goes, because nobody explains this part before you board the plane. Quick rule for this video. As of May 2026, 1 Australian dollar equals approximately 0.72 US dollars. That's the rate we are using throughout. Every price you see will be shown in both AUD and USD, so you never have to do the math yourself. Now, 10 categories. Each one costs more in Australia than America, and each one adds to a case you need to understand before you decide. 1. Property, the foundation of everything. Let's start with the biggest number, because it sets the ceiling on every financial decision that follows. In America, the U.S. median home price sits at around 400,000 US dollars, 555,000 Australian dollars. Yes, cities like San Francisco and New York push well above that. But in Phoenix, Nashville, Charlotte, Houston, you can buy a solid 3-bedroom home for 300,000 US dollars to 380,000 US dollars. And in the Midwest, even less. In Australia, the national median house price is now above 860,000 Australian dollars. That's 620,000 US dollars. But that national number hides what's actually happening in the cities where most migrants end up. Sydney's median house price is above 1.6 million Australian dollars, 1.15 million US dollars. Melbourne sits at around 900,000 Australian dollars, 648,000 US dollars. Brisbane is close to 850,000 Australian dollars, 612,000 US dollars. Perth, which was the affordable Australian city, is now around 750,000 Australian dollars, 540,000 US dollars. If you want to buy in Sydney on a single income, you are saving for a deposit for a decade. If you earn the Australian median salary of about 90,000 Australian dollars a year, a Sydney house costs you nearly 18 times your annual income. In the US, the equivalent ratio in a comparable major city is closer to 7 or 8. And for renters, a 1-bedroom apartment in Sydney's inner suburbs will run you 2,600 Australian dollars to 3,200 Australian dollars a month. 1,870 US dollars to 2,300 US dollars. That's without utilities. That's just the key in the door. Mini verdict. For property, whether buying or renting, Australia is significantly more expensive than the average American experience. The only cities where the US competes on price are San Francisco and New York. Everywhere else, America wins on housing cost. 2. Electricity and utilities. The bill nobody expects. This is one of the biggest hidden shocks for Americans moving to Australia. In America, the average American household pays around 130 US dollars to 160 US dollars a month on electricity. In temperate states like the Pacific Northwest, it can be under 100 US dollars. Even in Texas with air conditioning running hard through summer, most households stay under 200 US dollars. In Australia, electricity in Australia is structurally expensive and has been rising. The average electricity bill in Sydney is around 590 Australian dollars per quarter. That's roughly 197 Australian dollars a month, or 142 US dollars a month, just for electricity alone. Add gas and water, and Sydney households pay between 250 Australian dollars and 300 Australian dollars a month in total utilities. 180 US dollars to 216 US dollars. In Melbourne, it's similar, about 450 Australian dollars per quarter for electricity, 150 Australian dollars a month, or 108 US dollars. Adelaide and Queensland tend to run even higher. Why is it so expensive? Australia's electricity grid is heavily dependent on gas as a price-setting fuel. Gas prices surged when global supply chains disrupted in 2022, and that pricing shock never fully reversed. Aging coal infrastructure creates supply gaps. In Australia, despite having enormous natural resources, exports much of its gas overseas, leaving domestic consumers competing at global market prices. Mini verdict: Electricity costs are broadly comparable to mid-range American states, but trending higher. If you're coming from a low electricity cost state like Washington or Oregon, your quarterly bill could double. Factor $2,500 to $3,200 a year, $1,800 to $2,300 into your budget as a baseline. 3. Groceries and everyday food, the slow drain. This one surprises people because the prices in the supermarket don't look alarming until you do the math over a month. In America, the U.S. is the world's largest agricultural producer. That scale keeps grocery prices low. A family of 4 in the U.S. spends roughly $400 to $800 a month on groceries, depending on location and shopping habits. Stores like Walmart, Costco, and Aldi give Americans real price competition. A dozen eggs, around $3.50. Chicken breast per kilogram, about $6. A loaf of bread, $2.50 to $3.50. In Australia, the grocery market in Australia is dominated by 2 supermarket chains, Woolworths and Coles, which together control around 65% of the market. That level of duopoly has consequences for pricing. A dozen eggs, $5 to $8, $3.60 to $5.76. Chicken breast per kilogram, $10 to $14, $7.20 to $10.08. A loaf of bread, $3.50 to $5.50, $2.52 to $3.96. A flat white at a Sydney cafe, $5.50 to $6.50, $3.96 to $4.68. Every single day. For a family of 4, expect to spend $300 to $420 per week on groceries alone. That's $216 to $302 every week. Annually, that's between $11,200 and $15,700 just to feed your household. Australia does have Aldi, and it's genuinely cheaper, roughly 10 to 20% below the main chains. But even the Aldi price floor in Australia sits above the American baseline for most items. Mini verdict: groceries in Australia cost more than most American cities. Not shockingly more, but consistently more, across almost every item, every week. Over a year, a family of 4 will spend roughly $3,000 to $5,000 more on food in Australia than in the average American city. 4. Cars. The price nobody talks about. If you're moving from the US and you need to buy a car when you arrive, prepare yourself. In America, the average transaction price for a new car in the US is around $47,000 to $48,000. That's a real number. But the US market also has enormous volume. The country sells around 15 to 16 million vehicles a year, which creates intense competition between brands and gives buyers real negotiating power. A competent, reliable Toyota Camry can be had for $28,000 to $32,000. A Ford Ranger starts around $34,000. In Australia, Australia sells about 1.1 million vehicles a year, around 14 times fewer than the US market. Less volume means less competition, which means less pressure on price. A Toyota Camry in Australia will cost you $36,000 to $44,000, $25,900 to $31,700. That's actually somewhat comparable on a sticker price basis. But here's where it compounds. The Ford Ranger, Australia's most popular vehicle, starts at $48,000, $34,600, and easily pushes past $60,000, $43,200, once you add common specifications. And where the gap becomes enormous is in the luxury segment. Vehicles that American buyers can access for $60,000 to $80,000 routinely cost $150,000 to $180,000, $108,000 to $129,600 in Australia. Beyond the purchase price, Australian registration fees, stamp duty on the vehicle, and compulsory third-party insurance add 1,500 Australian dollars to 4,000 Australian dollars, 1,080 US dollars to 2,880 US dollars, in annual on-road costs that Americans don't face in the same form. Mini verdict. For mainstream vehicles, Australia is broadly competitive with the US on sticker price. But once you add holding costs, taxes, and registration, the total cost of car ownership is meaningfully higher. And if you're looking at premium or full-size vehicles, Australia is significantly more expensive. 5. Childcare, the financial earthquake for young families. If you have kids, or planning to have them, this chapter may be the most important one in this video. In America, childcare in the US is expensive. Nobody's pretending otherwise. The average American family pays between $1,000 US and $1,500 US a month for full-time childcare for one child, depending on the state. In high-cost states like California, it can reach $2,000 US or more. It's a genuine financial burden. In Australia, before government subsidies, full-time childcare in Australia costs 120 Australian dollars to 150 Australian dollars per day, per child. Per day. That's 2,400 Australian dollars to 3,000 Australian dollars per month, 1,728 US dollars to 2,160 US dollars, before any subsidy is applied. Australia does have a government childcare subsidy system, and for families earning below around 80,000 Australian dollars, the subsidy can be significant. But as incomes rise above that threshold, the subsidy reduces sharply. A dual-income professional couple earning 120,000 Australian dollars to 160,000 Australian dollars combined, which is not unusual, may still be paying 1,200 Australian dollars to 1,800 Australian dollars net per month, 864 US dollars to 1,296 US dollars after subsidies per child. If you have two children in care simultaneously, which happens, you're looking at 2,400 Australian dollars to 3,600 Australian dollars per month net, 1,728 US dollars to 2,592 US dollars, going to childcare alone. That's a second rent payment. Mini verdict. Childcare is one of the most brutal financial realities for young Australian families. The subsidy system helps low and middle incomes, but dual-income professional households, the exact demographic most likely to migrate to Australia, get partial relief at best. It's a category where Australia genuinely and consistently punishes young parents. 6. Income tax. The one that cuts both ways. This chapter is where the conversation gets more nuanced, because the answer depends entirely on where in America you lived before. In America, federal income tax in the US operates on progressive brackets. But the real variable is state income tax. If you live in Texas, Florida, Nevada, Washington, or one of the other no-income tax states, your total tax burden is just federal. At 100,000 US dollars, that's roughly 17,000 US dollars to 18,000 US dollars in federal tax. But if you live in California, your state adds another 9.3% to 13.3% on top. A 150,000 US dollars earner in California can pay close to 51,000 US dollars combined in federal and state income tax. New York and New Jersey are similarly punishing. In Australia abolished state income taxes in 1942. They've never come back. Every Australian, whether they live in Sydney or Darwin, pays the same federal rate with zero state income tax added. At 100,000 Australian dollars, roughly 72,000 US dollars, you'll pay approximately 22,967 Australian dollars in income tax plus a 2% Medicare levy of 2,000 Australian dollars. Total, around 25,000 Australian dollars, 18,000 US dollars, with nothing added by the state. At 150,000 Australian dollars, 108,000 US dollars, Australia's total tax burden is around 43,000 Australian dollars, 31,000 US dollars. A California resident at the equivalent income pays more. But this is only half the picture. Because on top of your salary, your Australian employer is legally required to pay 12% of your salary into a retirement fund called superannuation, and this is paid on top of your wage, not deducted from it. On an 100,000 Australian dollar salary, That's an extra 12,000 Australian dollars per year, 8,640 US dollars, going directly into your retirement savings, guaranteed, regardless of whether you contribute anything yourself. The average American 401k employer match is 3% to 5%, and only if you contribute your own money first. Mini verdict. If you were living in a no-tax U.S. state, Australia's income tax will probably cost you more. If you were in California, New York, or New Jersey, Australia's rates are competitive or better. And for long-term wealth building, the mandatory 12% super contribution is an advantage that doesn't show up in your take-home pay, but it shows up enormously in your retirement account. 7. Eating out and hospitality. The culture shock on the menu. This isn't just about restaurants. It's about the social cost of being an Australian. In America, a casual dinner for two at a mid-range American restaurant runs $50 US to $80 US, including a drink and a tip. Fast food meals average $8 US to $12 US. A beer bar, $5 US to $8 US. America's tipping culture adds 18% to 22% on restaurant bills, but the base prices before the tip are lower than Australia's. In Australia, there is no tipping culture in Australia, but the menu prices already include what amounts to a living wage for every hospitality worker, because Australia's minimum wage is 24.95 Australian dollars per hour, and weekend and public holiday penalty rates can push that to 35 Australian dollars to 50 Australian dollars per hour. Those wages are baked into every item on the menu. A sit-down meal for two at a mid-range Sydney or Melbourne restaurant, 90 Australian dollars to 130 Australian dollars, 65 US dollars to 94 US dollars. A beer at a pub, 10 Australian dollars to 12 Australian dollars, 7.20 US dollars to 8.64 US dollars. A coffee, as mentioned earlier, 5.50 Australian dollar to 6.50 Australian dollar, 3.96 US dollars to 4.68 US dollars. Every day, if that's your habit, is 140 Australian dollars to 170 Australian dollars a month just on coffee, 101 US dollars to 122 US dollars. Mini verdict. Eating and drinking out in Australia costs more than in most of America. Not dramatically more, but consistently more. And because the social culture in Australian cities is heavily built around cafes, pubs, and restaurants, the pressure to participate financially is real. Budget for it. 8. Consumer goods and electronics. The Australia tax. There's a term Australians use for the premium they pay on imported products, the Australia tax. It's not an official tariff. It's just the reality of being a small, isolated market at the bottom of the world. In America, consumer electronics, branded clothing, software, and hardware are priced in USD for a market of 330 million people. Competition is intense. Imports flow freely. An iPhone, a laptop, a piece of gym equipment, they're competitively priced. In Australia, the same iPhone 16 Pro that costs $999 US in the US retails for 1,849 Australian dollars in Australia. That's 1,331 US dollars at the current exchange rate. That's a 33% markup beyond currency conversion. Software subscriptions, cloud services, and streaming platforms routinely charge 20% to 40% more in AUD than the USD prices would imply after conversion. A gym membership that runs $30 US a month in most American cities costs 60 Australian dollars to 80 Australian dollars a month, 43 US dollars to 58 US dollars in Australian cities. This plays out across furniture, clothing, and imported brands. Australia's geographic isolation, small market size, and import logistics all add costs that gets passed directly to consumers. Mini verdict. Consumer goods carry a consistent premium in Australia. It's not a single catastrophic cost, but over a year, it adds up. Australians buying electronics, clothing, and name-brand goods effectively pay a 20% to 35% surcharge compared to equivalent American prices. 9. Education. The real comparison is about what you don't pay. This chapter contains the most significant advantage Australia has, and one major trap. In America, university education in the US is extraordinarily expensive. Public and state university tuition averages $10,000 to $15,000 per year. Private universities regularly exceed $55,000 per year. Student debt in America currently exceeds $1.7 trillion nationally. Many graduates carry $30,000 to $100,000 in loans at interest rates that grow throughout repayment. In Australia, domestic Australian students don't pay upfront for university. They attend under the HECS help system, where the government pays their fees and students repay only once they earn above a threshold, currently around $54,000 a year, through the tax system. Importantly, HECS debt is indexed to inflation, not interest rates. The repayment is income contingent, meaning it pauses if you lose your job or your income drops. A typical undergraduate degree under HECS costs $20,000 to $45,000 total, $14,400 to $32,400, with no interest, no upfront cost, and no loan shark waiting in the mail. For families with children, this is a structurally enormous advantage. The crushing weight of American student debt does not exist for Australian graduates in the same form. The trap: international students and temporary residents in Australia pay full fees, often $30,000 to $45,000 per year, $21,600 to $32,400. HECS is for citizens and permanent residents only. If you're on a temporary visa, this advantage doesn't apply to you until you're granted permanent residency. Mini verdict: for permanent residents and citizens, Australian university education is one of the most intelligently designed systems in the world. For temporary visa holders, the group most likely to be watching this video before migrating, the advantage is deferred until your residency status changes. 10. Healthcare, the most important financial comparison of all. We saved this one for last, because it's the number that changes the entire calculation. In America, employer-sponsored health insurance in the U.S. costs the average American employee around $1,400 a year in premiums for individual coverage, and $5,969 a year for family coverage. But that's just the premium. Deductibles average $1,700 for individual plans. Out-of-pocket maximums can reach $8,000 to $16,000 before the insurer covers 100%. A single emergency room visit without insurance can generate a bill of $3,000 to $30,000. A hospitalization, potentially hundreds of thousands. One serious illness can erase a decade of savings. This is not hyperbole. Medical bankruptcy is a uniquely American phenomenon. It does not meaningfully exist in Australia. In Australia, every Australian resident pays a Medicare levy of 2% of taxable income. On 100,000 Australian dollars, $72,000, that's 2,000 Australian dollars per year, $1,440. In return, unlimited GP visits at no cost when using a bulk billing doctor, free hospitalization in public hospitals, subsidized prescriptions under the pharmaceutical benefit scheme. Many medications cost between $7 and $31, $5 and $22, regardless of their actual market price. No deductibles. No out-of-pocket maximum surprises. No medical debt from emergency surgery. High-income earners without private health insurance pay an additional 1% to 1.5% Medicare levy surcharge. But even including private health insurance, which many Australians choose for shorter waiting lists for elective procedures, the total cost averages $1,500 to $3,000 a year, $1,080 to $2,160. Full stop. Mini verdict. Healthcare is Australia's single most powerful financial advantage over the United States. For an American family, the risk of a catastrophic medical event destroying their savings is a real financial planning variable. In Australia, that risk category essentially disappears. This one factor alone changes the total financial comparison more than any other. Final verdict. So, 10 categories. Let's put the scorecard on the table. Australia is more expensive than America in property prices in major cities, consumer goods and electronics, new cars, eating and drinking out, childcare for working parents, and groceries. Australia is roughly equivalent to America in utilities and income tax in many scenarios. Australia is meaningfully cheaper than America in healthcare and university education for permanent residents. Here is the honest verdict. If you are a young professional, no kids, renting, healthy, moving from a high-tax American state like California or New York, Australia is financially competitive. The wages are solid, the tax system won't punish you worse, and the healthcare backstop removes a genuine financial risk you carry every day in America. If you are a young family with 2 kids in childcare, Australia will shock you. The childcare costs during those 3 to 5 years when both parents are working and children are under school age can consume an additional 30,000 Australian dollars to 50,000 Australian dollars a year, 21,600 US dollars to 36,000 US dollars, beyond what an equivalent American family pays. That is not a small difference. That is a different standard of living. If you are coming from Texas or Florida, no state income tax, low cost of living, Australia will feel expensive across almost every category. The wages are higher, but so is everything you spend them on. The most accurate summary: Australia offers more financial security with less financial upside. Your floor is higher. You won't go bankrupt from a medical bill, you won't retire with nothing, and you won't graduate from university in debt. But your ceiling is lower. American high earners in low-tax states, particularly in tech and finance, build wealth faster in absolute terms. The question you have to answer is personal. Are you optimizing for upside, or are you optimizing for stability? Here's what I want you to tell me in the comments. Which category surprised you the most? And here's the harder question underneath that one. If healthcare in America were free, would you still consider Australia? That answer will tell you a lot about what you're actually running toward and what you're actually running from.